Hi, and thanks for joining me. Today we're out exploring the villages to the northwest of Doncaster. It's an area whose recent history, certainly during the 20th century, centred around the mining industry. So we'll be looking at the sites of a couple of pits and discovering their highs and lows. But there's also a lot of much earlier history to look at as well. We're starting out at the village of Barnby Done. This is a very old settlement area, and the village is mentioned in the Domesday Book. It was originally called House on Dun, after the River Don running beside it. But in the late 19th century, the name was changed to Barnby, or for short Barnby Done, due to the farms and farm buildings in the surrounding area. The co-op store on the right here used to be the Star Inn. Now back in the early 70s, before we got married, me and the wife and a few friends used to come here quite often. There'd be 6 of us in an old minivan. We'd have a few beers and sometimes play dominoes. It went the way of many village pubs and closed in 2017. We've got the canal to our left here, which we'll come back to. We're just going to take a little run round the back of the village to look at the old church. The village has obviously grown over the years, and there's a lot of new housing, but it always looks a nice place. This is the church of St Peter and St Paul and dates from the early 14th century. It's a Grade 1 listed building. I'm going to stop round the front as well because there's several large gargoyles that are quite unusual. If you didn't know, gargoyles are actually decorative water spouts that carry water from the roof and away from the sides of the building. There are 3 on this side, and they're very old, very weathered, but they're also quite large for such a low building. We're turning right up here to go over the Canal Bridge. This is a modern lifting bridge built in the early 1980s, but I remember the previous swing bridge. It was operated manually by a bloke that came out of his little hut and pushed the bridge round by hand whenever a barge wanted to pass. I'm going to stop over the other side and just have a look. I've stopped in a car park that sits between the canal and what was the old course of the River Don. The Don used to come round in a big loop right at the side of the village, but the course was altered a long time ago. The new alignment's about 1/3 of a mile up the road, and the original river we see here is now effectively just a long winding pond. We're just going over the new River Don alignment now. With all the recent rain, the level's up a bit and it's filling its natural bank. The cows are grazing on the sides of the flood banks. When things get bad, the river overflows the flood banks onto the flood plain. These yellow gates on either side of the road are closed when that happens to shut the road off to traffic. There's another set at the other end of the road. This happens quite often. The area to our right, behind the trees, is the site of the old Thorpe Marsh power station. There's nothing left there now, but this was a local landmark for donkey's years, and the 6 cooling towers could be seen for miles. When it was working, each Christmas they'd project huge coloured images onto the cooling towers at night. It looked quite spectacular. It was a coal-fired station built in 1959, and it was actually a prototype for all the big modern stations in the UK. It closed in 1994 and the cooling towers finally demolished in 2012. We're coming into the village of Arksey now. This is another old settlement and predates the Domesday Book, probably as far back as Roman times. Even Bronze Age artefacts have been found in the area. The name Arksey derives from Ark, an Old English personal name Arsel, or an Old Norse equivalent Arkil, and sea from the Old English for a water meadow or island surrounded by water. Together we get the water meadow of Arsil. The oldest building remaining in the village is, not surprisingly, the church. This is All Saints or All Hallows Church, as it was originally named. Construction started around 1150, and it's quite an impressive building for what was a poor medieval village. Next calls Bentley. Now this is more a suburb of Doncaster, but it's a pit village that grew up around Bentley Colliery. The road we're heading up here was the main road to the pit, and the houses on either side were the miners' houses. The pit opened in 1906 and was originally manned by miners who moved here from the Nottingham area. The local geology wasn't good, and they had to overcome quicksand and water when the main shaft was sunk. There were constant problems with methane gas, and it was beset by accidents and face closures because of safety reasons. Not surprisingly, it suffered accidents and disasters in its 87-year span of operation. In 1912 there was an underground explosion that killed 3 men and a further 6 were badly burned. In 1978 a paddy train taking miners to the coalface ran away on a downhill gradient and derailed. It killed 7 men with a further 17 injured. The worst one, however, happened on the 20th of November 1931. At 5:45 in the afternoon, fire damp, which is methane gas, ignited on one of the coal faces, causing an explosion with roof falls that blocked the way to the shaft. Following the explosion, there was a second inrush of gas that starved the oxygen from the air. 4 men went down the pit in breathing apparatus and had to carry the survivors over 2 miles to safety. Sadly, 45 men died and 5 of the bodies couldn't be recovered. Subsequently, the 4 rescuers and another 4 miners were awarded the Edward Medal for their bravery. The pit closed in 1993 with the loss of 450 jobs and still leaving huge coal reserves underground. Today the site's been converted into woodland and opened up as the Bentley Community Woodland, as we see here. Right, we're heading out to the west of Doncaster now, and we're going to take a little run through the village of Cosworth. This is another ancient village. It's mentioned in the Domesday Book. This part is mainly stone-built houses and cottages, and a lovely little church here just on the left. Some of the buildings here date back to the 16th century. In fact, it's sometimes referred to as a piece of the Cotswolds in Yorkshire, mainly because of the historic cottages, its rural location, and it's being situated on the edge of a plateau, much like villages in the Cotswolds. The original Manor House and estate belonged to Sir Christopher Wray, who was actually Speaker of the House of Commons in 1571. This is the current hall, and it was built in 1740. Doncaster Council bought it in 1961 and turned it into a museum, which it still is today. That's the A1M just in front. We're turning north now onto Sheepwalk Lane. I love some of these old quirky road names, and the meanings and origins are long lost in time. This is the A638 we're crossing here. That's the main Doncaster to Barnsley road. We've just turned left now onto the B6422, heading west again towards Broadsworth. Now this area is known as Little Canada. It got that name because the houses that were first built here back in the last century were of wooden construction. At the time, that, along with the surrounding open flat plateau, it was said it resembled the Canadian prairies. Takes a bit of imagination now with all the modern brick-built houses that have replaced the originals. The woodlands to the right is another site of a former pit. This was Broadsworth Colliery that operated from 1905 to 1990. In its heyday during the 1980s, it employed around 2,800 workers. Now, like many, its site has now been turned into community woodland. We're just about to pass underneath the A1M here. This is the village of Broadsworth. Away to our left, unfortunately hidden behind trees and parkland, is Broadsworth Hall. This is a Grade 1 listed building, and the present hall dates from the 1860s. It replaced an earlier Georgian house. Back in 1790, the estate was bought by Peter Theluson. There's a Swiss bloke whose family were bankers. He was actually a director of the Bank of England. Much of his fortune was made from the slave trade and imported tobacco and sugar. Interestingly, in his will, he stipulated that his fortune should be put into trust for 3 generations. On his death in 1897, the family contested this unsuccessfully, and it wasn't until 1859, over 60 years later, that the beneficiaries, which included his great-grandson, were able to get access to it. It was his great-grandson that then had the present house built. Today it's owned by English Heritage and it's open to the public. They have an annual classic car show that I've attended in the past. That's always a good show. We're entering the village of Hooten Pagnell now. Lovely old place. It's actually named in the Domesday Book as Hotone, which means the town on the hill, or the high dwelling place. The second part of the name was added in the 11th century and refers to the Pagnell family who took over ownership of the manor. So the full name means the high dwelling place of the Pagnells. Over the centuries, different spellings have been used for both parts of the name. In 1254, it received a royal charter to hold a weekly market, and there's a commemorative plaque up here on the wall. This is what remains of the old butter cross. A lot of the properties in the village are owned by the estate of Hooten Pagnell Hall. We'll take a little ride round because the stone built houses and buildings are just beautiful. We're outside Hooten Pagnell Hall now, and this was probably the front entrance at one time. The hall's been altered and added to over the centuries, but the core of the building dates from the 14th century. Today it's privately owned and now does boutique accommodation and weddings. It's a Grade 2 listed building. The church next to it is All Saints Church, and that dates from Norman times. Interestingly, during the Reformation in the 16th century, the building was all whitewashed. It was restored back to its former glory in the 1870s by the owner of the estate, and today it's a Grade 1 listed building. We're heading back now, but there's just one more stop I want to make, and it's a bit of a strange one. This is the A680 and is the old Great North Road. It's quite a busy road, so I'll skip to the interesting bit. We're at the village of Hampole. It's only a very small place, sitting right at the side of the old Great North Road. The name comes from the Old English name of Hannah and Poll, which means Hannah's Pool, the first bit being someone's name. The interesting bit we've stopped to look at is this ruin right on the side of the busy trunk road. Now, I must have driven past this place hundreds of times over the years, but this is the first time I've actually stopped to take a close look. It's recorded as a Grade 2 listed building that dates from the early 19th century, although parts of the house are thought to be much older, but I've not been able to find out anything much about its origins. It's known as Manor House or Ivy Farm Manor, and more recently as the Doctor's House by locals, because it belonged to a psychiatrist in the late 1980s, early 90s. He gained notoriety by discharging a patient with known violent problems from psychiatric care, who 2 days later went on to kill a young girl. This was in 1991, and the doctor moved out of the house very shortly after, and it was just left abandoned and fell into ruin. About 20 years later, a local Doncaster photographer went to the now ruined house and took numerous photos in and around it, and articles appeared in the press at the time. He found all sorts that had just been left abandoned there by the previous owner, including 5 cars which were left in the garage and elsewhere around the property. These included a Marcos 1800 GT and a 1964 Humber Super Snipe Series 4. Needless to say, they were all in quite advanced state of dilapidation. Makes an interesting story, and I'd love to know more about its early history. Now, the Victorians were into follies and made all kinds of structures to look much older than they actually were, and this is no different. Some of what look at first glance to be stone windows and balustrades actually appear to be concrete castings, because in places where the weathering's bad you can clearly see the pebbles mixed into the structure. Anyway, it's an interesting ruin, and it certainly caught the interest of national and local newspapers back in 2013, and several YouTube videos made by urban explorers over the years. I'll try to put some links in the description. Right, I've rambled on enough now, so time to wrap up there. Hope you've enjoyed this little tour and found the history interesting. Don't forget to leave a like if you have. Drop me a comment, and if you want to watch more of my ramblings, please subscribe to the channel. Hope you can join me again, so cheers for now.